Hi, Mickey.
Hey, Bob. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you doing?
Not so good. I'm sick. I have a toothache. You know, I was reading an interview with the screenwriter Aaron Sorkin, who said, he likes to take lots of little refreshing showers every day, when he's working, because he gets a burst of energy with each shower.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't take that shower, Bob.
Oh, and I'm going to pay the price for that, aren't I?
So we're going to have the lethargic pre-shower, Mickey. But
okay. Well, that's better than the high-anxiety pre-shower, Mickey, which I was afraid of.
Yeah, I was late. I was up late last night blogging about Newsweek, my former employer.
Yeah, I saw that post. So the Tina Brown's debut issue of Newsweek is out. What do you think of it, Mickey?
In a vengeful way. Well, about 3 hours before I saw the cover, I read an article in Yahoo, I think, about the new Newsweek, and it sounded great. And it may still be great, but the cover is like a total snooze from the previous era. You haven't seen
the magazine, right, because it hasn't gotten to the West Coast?
I haven't seen the actual issue, although some of the articles are now online.
And you've seen them. And now, and the cover, we should say, is, I would say, a fetching picture of Hillary Clinton.
A fetching, suitable for framing in the State Department.
I wouldn't call it edgy.
It's like something that you put away in your attic 10 years ago, Bob, and you've dusted off today, and it's exactly the same.
You know, Mickey, I really enjoy your vendettas, and I think we're going to get a lot of mileage out of your Tina Brown vendetta.
I was hoping I would. I'm now worried that it's going to collapse and be a failure without me getting sufficient mileage out of it.
No. She'll keep it going long enough for us to enjoy your resentment of her.
But I don't resent her just because she didn't want my blog.
No, just because she fired you?
No.
Why would that lead to any bitterness? Just because she fired you.
It liberated me to say what I think.
Yeah, and you're grateful for the fact that she fired you.
She also owes me $7,000. Do you think she's not going to pay?
I would call that a drop in the bucket compared to her firing you.
No, that's not why I'm mad at her. That's why I'm worried about attacking her, because then the check might not come.
Oh, she's above that kind of thing.
I'm sure she's above it.
She may not even be watching this right now.
I'm sure she's above that Betty sort of thing. But
this brings out the best in you, though. Look, can I read from your blog?
Sure, the point is...
This deserves quoting, the trashing you did of this issue of Newsweek.
Okay.
You write, I had expected that some of the desperate, hit-crazed undercurrent of the Daily Beast might carry over into Newsweek's initial presentation. But desperation would be an improvement. Desperation is a form of vitality. That hurts.
You're not bitter enough when you read that, Bob.
She's smarting. And then the other thing you said is, for now, though, it looks as if Tina has done the impossible. She's made John Meacham seem young. For those who don't know, he was the previous editor of Newsweek, who himself did not exactly scream out young and
John
zany.
Meacham's always struck people as an old man in a young man's body. He's very, very talented.
As opposed to you, a young man in an old man's body.
There you go. He's very, very talented and a wonderful writer. And compared with the current issue of Newsweek, his old issues actually made reference to something that had happened in the last few years.
Well, you haven't even seen the issue, Mickey.
But you can judge news magazine covers are a big deal. The cover is the attempt to take the reader, grab him by the lapels, and say, you want to read this magazine. So you can judge a news magazine in part on what's on the cover. Did the cover do its job? And this cover does not grab you by the lapels and say, you want to read this magazine. This magazine says, there are a bunch of articles in here by Tina's friends, like Harvey Weinstein. I bet you were eager to read Harvey Weinstein's.
Hey, that's a fresh new byline. I haven't seen that in many magazines.
There you go. And I'm sure Harvey Weinstein is going to dish on Harvey Weinstein, which is what the real stuff you want to read. There's a piece by Kathleen
I'm not sure
Parker,
everyone knows his connection to the magazine, Mickey. But
sorry?
I'm not sure everyone knows about his connection to the magazine.
Harvey Weinstein is was the head of Miramax. He's a big movie mogul. He's, financed some of the...
Okay, but he's not an investor, right?
I don't think he's an investor.
No, he's not connected. He was connected to Talk, her previous magazine.
They had a big...
okay.
They had a big fight over whether he was going to pull the plug on Talk, and he did, I think. Her new venture is funded by Barry Diller, and Barry Diller has managed to hornswoggle...
I get my Hollywood moguls mixed up.
Hornswoggle Sidney Harmon into footing half the bill. So they have two moguls behind it. And I suspect Sidney Hartman does not let at that edge of cutting-edge youth, although he's a natural treasure, as he says. But anyways, so it's a bunch of the story of why she published the stories. Looks much more interesting than the stories. There's some. I was a little nasty about she's staging some big deal conference of 150 women movers and shakers. And, there is a legitimate argument behind it, which is that women's rights are one way to challenge repressive third world societies. I'm not sure the way you do that is by having a big splashy conference in New York where you reward all your friends, though. What do you think of that?
Well, maybe this is the Atlantic model where conferences become one form of revenue generation.
I don't think this is a revenue generation. I think it's a way of...
This is a buzz generator
I think
conference?
It's a buzz generator, a friend rewarder. And I think she actually thinks that women's rights are a great weapon in democracy's arsenal. What do you think of that?
I don't even know what you're talking about. I mean, what are you talking about?
Well, for example, in Afghanistan, if the schooling of women is a great reform threatened by the Taliban. If we could somehow mobilize all the women in Afghanistan who want to be schooled on our side, maybe that's a good thing. And there are various people.
Well, I think long term the empowerment of women is. Short term, it's a dicey political issue in cultures like that.
Short term, it seems like a good way to get all these women killed.
Well, this guy Greg, whatever, not Morrison, whatever, the guy who wrote 3 Cups of Tea or whatever,
yes.
he's had some success. I direct people to him, but meanwhile, Andrew Sullivan is headed Tina's way.
Right. The point is, she's bought the best writers in American journalism and loaded them aboard the Titanic. She's committed. Her basic problem is she's committed to a model of big bucks, big splash journalism in a new world that doesn't seem to support that. And so she's got Howie Kurtz and Peter Boyer and Lloyd Grove and Andrew Sullivan and all sorts of very, very expensive, good talent. And she's now, the desperation comes from, oh my God, we got to generate enough revenue to cover this payroll. If she had Blogging Heads payroll, Bob, she wouldn't have the air of desperation. She'd have the...
If she had the payroll and her traffic,
she'd have the laid-back air of quiet competence that you exude. But,
yes.
But because she has to pay these huge salaries, oh my God, we got to generate the hits. And it doesn't look like they're having fun. It looks like they're on a desperate treadmill having fake fun.
How can you? What's the sign of that? How do you know when they're having fake fun?
It's an air that all the headlines exude. What's hot here? What's hot there? It's not. You don't get the.
Well, that's always been her style.
Well, that's true, but
it's always been what she does for you is put you in touch with the stuff you need to be in touch with.
But it's sort of.
I think it's a pretty good site. I've got to say. I mean,
I'm not saying it's a bad site. I'm saying it has an air of desperation and it will fail economically.
Well, whether much of anything can succeed is an open question. On the other hand, I would say that as for Andrew Sullivan, before this he was at the Atlantic, and they apparently made money this year, notwithstanding his non-trivial salary.
Well, that's right, but they were in a big salary dispute, I think, and also
you may know more about it than I do.
That money comes in part from these bogus conferences they stage.
No, but I think the line is that even without the conferences, the Atlantic made money last year.
That is not.
That was how the New York Times article I read.
The New York Times article I read had a specific line saying that it includes the money from conferences. It doesn't include a lot of other bogus things they could have done to attempt to show a profit. I think it's a legitimate profit and a huge coup for them. But it does include the revenue from the conference.
So what model works then? Is there any model that works? If you're saying that the Atlantic is really doing it on the basis of conferences, which I doubt, but anyway, and you're saying the Daily Beast won't do it at all. Who is doing it?
I'm saying they showed a profit on the basis of a budget that included the money. I'm not saying they only made it. They're also generating money in other ways.
Well, how's the Daily Caller doing? Your new home. They're prominently featuring a really dramatic, grainy black and white photo of a portion of your forehead.
I think that's a permanent visual element of the design.
Oh my God, that's going to be there forever?
Yes, I'm afraid so. It's also stuck on my head forever. It's like, I guess I could have plastic surgery. We've had this argument before. You've sketched the only plausible salvation on the horizon, which is that advertisers come to know enough about individual web surfers that they're willing to pay more for ads than just the generic "get me a million eyeballs."
Right.
And I claim that your model is enhanced by what you might call the Bernstein nightmare, which is that rich people will tend to be smarter people and more lucrative to advertise. Smart people will tend to be richer people. So if you have a smart website, you'll attract rich people and more advertisers. So Bob Wright will benefit from higher ad rates than some other website that's not as smart. But that's a secondary argument.
I think there's smart rich and there's smart poor, and I'm not sure we have the smart rich. But better the smart poor than no smart at all, I've always said. So then if we're starting to say things we've already said, should we move on to Libya? Or do you have more to say about the modern media landscape and your bitter resentment of Tina Brown's success?
No, I just think the Daily Beast is a large, slow-moving, profusely bleeding target.
Well, have at it, Mickey. I'm looking forward to this.
It doesn't. I've written 2 items on, and they don't, and readers don't seem to have flocked to them. So there's not going to be any reward for it.
But I was going to say the opposite. I think you should turn your blog largely into a media criticism blog. You're good and vicious. It's good. You should do it. Trust me.
It sort of naturally turns into a media criticism blog, whether I like it or not. Okay.
I want more. Build it and they will come. So what do you think about this Libya thing?
It's like immigration. You want to do it, but it doesn't bring in the hits.
It's not like immigration. That's why I want you to blog about it instead of immigration.
Okay. Libya, first. Our last discussion of this began with you saying that Obama had failed in Egypt. Do you take that back?
I'm taking that back.
Good.
Yeah, but who would have guessed that the tide was going to turn, possibly because this Google guy went on TV and started crying.
Is that what?
That was a galvanizing moment. I could not.
Why did that turn the tide?
As I was saying that, he was heading for the studio to do his crying. How was I to anticipate that?
How did that change events in Egypt?
Oh, you weren't paying attention, buddy. That brought the ordinary Egyptians out. It was a widely watched TV show, and he conveyed that the face of the revolution was the true Egyptian. These were not elites, outsiders. He just there was a lot of coverage of this moment. Anyway, whether or not he was crucial, that the moment of turnabout came right in that 24, 48 hours, and we were taping at the beginning of it.
Why didn't Obama realize it was going to happen? Because he was quietly working his leverage with the Egyptian military.
Well, meanwhile, you just criticized Obama for what he's saying about Libya. You've got a post complaining about him saying Qaddafi must do this.
I was echoing Leon Wieselter's complaint, which I claimed to have had before, though I don't seem to have published, which is Obama runs around saying they must do this and people must do that, and that is the language of the powerless yet self-righteous New York Times editorial page, which he obviously reads too much of. So he said, Qaddafi must do this and Qaddafi must do that. Well, if you're president of the United States and you say Qaddafi must do this and Qaddafi doesn't do it, but instead attacks the demonstrators and retakes the port city as he did apparently within the last 24 hours, what are you going to do about it, Mr. Must?
I agree, and he shouldn't talk like that unless he's sure that he's going to deliver. I mean, American presidents in general tend to talk too much like that, but and I wonder what he's going to do now. He just, right before we came on to tape this a couple hours ago, gave another little utterance where he said, those around Qaddafi must know that ultimately they will be held accountable for continuing violence. But, the very substantial counterattack is now underway, and I'm sure it includes some things we'd all call atrocities. And so if a certain amount of killing of civilians, it reportedly does.
There's one solution that you and I and everybody would agree to, which is that the United Nations ordered a no-fly zone Even Gates has said, I think, that he would go along with that.
Even who said
Even
that?
our Secretary of Defense.
Well, this is my prerequisite. I mean, I think whatever Obama decides, I mean, it could be a no-fly zone. It could be just giving the rebels anti-aircraft weapons, and then we wouldn't have to do the monitoring ourselves. But whatever you do, I think what Obama should do is say, look, here's what I think we should do. We're introducing this resolution to the Security Council. If Russia or China wants to veto it, okay, then we won't do it. I mean, and you know, then the blood will be on their hands if there's blood. But what bothers me is this idea that every problem in the world is America's to solve, and once we decide something has to be done, then it's a failure of the American president if it doesn't get done. No, it's the whole world's problem. We're willing to do our share. We're willing to exert moral leadership, even bear a disproportionate portion of the military burden. But everybody's got to sign on to it. I mean, the major powers have to sign on. If they don't, then what happens is their fault.
If America could do something, let's say stop the Rwanda genocide, with or without the UN, and the UN doesn't sign on, does that actually absolve America of moral responsibility if it could do it and save thousands of lives?
Well, first of all, I'm not talking about the Rwandan genocide. In fact, one problem we face in Libya is that, okay, I'll get back to that, is that this is kind of morphed into, in the early days, it seemed like an easy kind of call on humanitarian grounds. You got protesters, you're killing them. But now it's becoming a classic civil war where, look, you know, Qaddafi could say, I'm killing guys that have guns that want to kill me, okay? I mean, that's, you know, and they're marching in my direction. That's different. You know, although I'm sure that, again, there are out-and-out atrocities going on, but still, it's becoming harder to mount a rationale to intervene. You know, I would say, yes, if we fail to act and could act to prevent some massive tragedy, which this doesn't seem comparable to, then, yeah, we bear some of the moral burden. But on the other hand, if we propose to the great powers, if we say, let's do something about it, we're ready to go, and one or two of them veto it and say, well, we're not, then they bear the greater share of the moral.
I don't know the politics of the UN. Who would veto it?
Russia or China. You know, there are 5 permanent members that have veto power. Those are the 2 that might veto intervention in Libya. Because, first of all, this whole business of authoritarians being threatened by uprisings scares them both. And
as it scares us.
Yeah, and secondly, there are specific, well, for different reasons, though. We don't find it a domestic threat unless you think the Wisconsin protesters were inspired by it, and maybe they were a little, but secondly, Russia has these specific areas like Chechnya,
right.
where they have basically committed atrocities to keep it under control, and they wouldn't want the world intervening. Of course, one thing you can say is, look, you know, you can always veto intervention in your country, you know. But they worry about the precedent.
Right. What do you think of the Obama's the new strategy of regime alteration?
Yeah, you had a lot of fun with this on your blog, right? Explain the background.
Well, I guess the argument is that Bush at one point seemed to have a philosophy of regime change, where he wanted to promote democracy throughout the region, and, you know, if that meant the governments changed in Egypt and even Saudi Arabia, hey, we're for democracy. Obama doesn't want to, you know, do that. In fact, they're quite worried, rightly so, that revolutions across the region will wind up not installing democratic forces, but installing undemocratic or democratic but Islamist forces that aren't in our national interest. So and he's worried that the existing oligarchs will be upset when we don't back people like Mubarak. So that what they settled on at the State Department is we're not for regime change, we're for regime alteration. In other words,
well, the State Department hasn't really officially used that phrase. The Wall Street Journal reporter said some unnamed
a senior
person
national security official. Yes, okay. So it could be a White House official, could be Tom Donilon or somebody like that.
Yeah, I mean,
we will back the future Mubaraks of the world as long as they will set themselves on a course of reform, that will eventually not even go in the right direction. And it just seems where it starts. It starts, they say whatever the dictator says, well, we've appointed a commission to look into democratic reforms, and we say, okay, we'll back you, and then the commission gradually is starved to death over the next 6 years.
Right.
So I don't quite see where this is a major advance.
No, I don't either. I mean, and I think we show troubling signs of being on the wrong side of history here.
What do you think? I mean, various people are impressed by the extent to which the neocons are, in your terms, on the right side of history. They're all saying they're gung-ho for overthrowing Qaddafi, and they don't care if it really hurts Israel or helps Israel in the short run. A, do you think they're sincere, and B, do you think it hurts Israel?
You were the one who last time out raised questions about their sincerity when we discussed this, so I'll let you handle that part of it.
But I haven't been watching TV and I haven't seen them, and people say that they at least seem sincere.
They seem to mean it?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me it's obvious if you're a discredited figure like Elliot Abrams, the way you rehabilitate yourself is by associating yourself with this popular revolution. It
could make sense, I think. I think, it could make sense that if you are a friend of Israel but can view the situation with a little more detachment than the average Israeli, because you're on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, that yes, you could welcome this, and whereas it would freak you out if you were in Israel, because change is scary, and you can imagine all kinds of nightmare scenarios, and it truly is uncertain what's going to happen. But the argument for it being in favor of Israel is, I think the classic neocon argument is that anti-Israel sentiment among the Arab masses has been kind of whipped up by authoritarian leaders to as a way to deflect resentment from themselves, and more generally that just the kind of frustration that people, including young males, undergo in an authoritarian regime, especially one with a statist economy, winds up having unhealthy outlets. Now, the left-wing reply to this is that the neocons, that's an explanation that keeps them from admitting that, no, actually, one reason a lot of Arabs hate Israel is because of Israel's actual policies, settlements.
And the other argument is that even in democratic states, politicians whip up support by fostering resentments against outside enemies.
Well, they do, especially in so-called illiberal democracies. But I do think long run, I mean, first of all, I think the argument that the neocons are making is plausible, that in the long run, the chances of a stable order there would be furthered by, liberal democracy, free political expression, and on and on and on. But even if in the short run it was unsettling and even destabilizing from Israel's point of view. I think that's a coherent argument that probably a lot of them believe. I certainly think that from the point of view of the broader kind of war on terror perspective, this is long-run good. Absolutely. Or at least stands a better chance than not of being long-run good. And that's one reason I hate to see, if you're right, and Obama's reverting to some sort of regime alteration policy. I kind of hate to see that. I think,
Bahrain seems to be the one that's really scared them because our fleet is based there.
Yeah, our fleet is based there, but what do we need that fleet for? Here's the thing, there are basically two rationales for having our fleet there. First of all, it's another sign of us bearing the entire burden of the world, right? Somebody's got to maintain order in this region. Must be us. Well, no. I don't know why it should be us. The two reasons classically given for us having a big presence there are oil and Israel. So I say, solve the Israel problem, and the oil rationale is bullshit to begin with.
Why isn't the rationale that we're the world's only superpower, we can do it, and it's in our interest to control events more than not to control them?
What portion of the world's GDP do we have? I don't know what the answer is, but that is the portion I think we should contribute. And one reason we're the world's only superpower is because we keep agreeing, to do this stuff. no, let us pay a ton of money for all these armaments. Let us get our people killed. Let us have everyone in the world hate us because of the interventions that the other, I mean, this does not have to be. Europe can afford very significant armaments, and this part of the world is a hell of a lot closer to them than to us.
Doesn't this have a danger from your perspective, which you just alluded to, which is it sort of makes it harder to argue that the main obstacle to Middle East peace is the Palestinian problem? Because it sure looks like the main obstacle to Middle East peace is all these dictators who are being overthrown.
It looks like a primary source of aggravation in the Arab world is the dictators. And again, this is that kind of neocon argument that's the root source even of some of the anti-Israel stuff, which could be true. I do think it is the root source of some of the anti-Americanism, because we help prop up the dictators, and that's why I hate to see us continue to play this game.
Well, I guess the argument for regime alteration is we would publicly announce and have like frequent clashes with people saying you're not moving fast enough in the direction of democracy.
That is such transparent bullshit. I mean...
Well, but sometimes authoritarians do set a transition for democracy that works. Who would have thought that Juan Carlos of Spain would usher in democracy?
I just think we should have a single principled position, and not try to micromanage the thing, and just say we were always on the side of the right of people to peacefully protest. We think they should have a vote. We think, they should have a right, to internet access and everything else. And we think they should not be killed for expressing their views. And that's our view.
I think we shouldn't say they must do things.
No, we shouldn't say they must do things unless we have a way to make them do them.
You provided the perfect transition to talking about the effect of the internet on all this. Can we do that?
I'm game.
I didn't realize that Malcolm Gladwell had written this article a few months before all these revolutions happened, saying that he doubted the effect of Twitter and Facebook in sort of fomenting the kind of activism that it would take to bring about regime change. And it seemed to me he made like an obvious mistake. He had this insight, where he said, well, gee, to really bring about social change like the civil rights movement brought in the South, it took tremendous courage and personal bonds. And what the internet fosters is light bonds, weak bonds among a lot of people. And he sort of tried to blow that up into an article without realizing the obvious rejoinder, which is, well, yes, there were 4 guys who sat at the lunch counter in Greensboro. They had tight bonds. If they'd had the internet, they could have met 4 other guys who had tight bonds with themselves, and 4 other guys. And 4 other guys, then you'd have 16 guys in groups of 4, all with tight bonds, who could be completely courageous. And so the internet doesn't just foster weak bonds, it lets people who have strong bonds get to know each other.
Yeah.
That was so obvious that it's bored you. You're falling asleep.
No, I'm thinking about it. I mean, I was going to say something a little... I mean, I think basically the evidence bears you out. I think... his piece was kind of a hostage to fortune as it happened, because he ended it with something like an actual prediction. I mean, let me see. He says this is a couple of months before Tunisia and Egypt, and he says, this internet stuff makes it easier for activists to express themselves and harder for that expression to have any impact. The instruments of social media are well suited to making the existing social order more efficient. They are not a natural enemy of the status quo. And then he says, he's talking about Clay Shirky, who holds the other half of this view. And the final paragraph of Malcolm's article is, Shirky ends this story, well, I won't get into this, but by asking what happens next. And then Malcolm says, what happens next is more of the same. And actually, no. What happened next was the most epic, revolution of our generation, the beginning of what may be a long wave of them, clearly abetted by digital technology. And I think you're right. I mean, well, tell me if this is what you're saying. I mean, one thing he says is that the internet, these loose ties are not conducive to a kind of well-run, disciplined organization that it takes to really make change. But the fact is that in Egypt, they showed tremendous discipline. They did not succumb to the provocations by and large. They kept it a peaceful movement and so on. And we kind of found out that there had been more real organization building going on for a longer time than we realized. There were people putting this together. And as you suggested, they used information technology to build their movement.
He has two arguments. One is that weak bonds don't you do really courageous things like stand up to tanks because you have strong personal bonds with other people on the internet. You're not about to do that for your Facebook buddies. You do that for your actual friends. And the second thing is this problem of organization, that there's some things that dispersed non-hierarchical organizations can do as well as controlled hierarchical organizations, but there's no reason why you can't have a controlled hierarchical organization that uses the internet. So
that is true. And moreover, on that first point, doesn't galvanize you to take personal risk and so on. Some people have argued that actually Facebook does do a certain amount of that. It solves the collective action problem. When you're sitting in your house and there's supposed to be a demonstration and you're thinking, well, I'm not going to be the first one to pour out on the street. Who knows what kind of flak we're going to encounter. The argument has been made that because people sense the presence of one another on Facebook and the enthusiasm, or in some other manifestation of the internet, and it's not just Facebook by any means, that is what gave them in Egypt the courage, the first round of protesters, the courage to converge on that square.
Well, it's interesting. I've seen this in the news reports, and I may be misinterpreting it, but it seems to me there's sort of these flash mob attacks on various security state sites in Egypt where they, surround the Interior Ministry and go in and steal all the documents before they can be burned. That must be terrifying to people in power in Egypt because, these things can be organized on a moment's notice. They can say, okay, everybody go down to the Defense Department and sack the Pentagon. And they don't know where it's coming. They can't prepare for it. It does give people this sort of momentary courage in numbers. And it could be devastating. And I don't quite see why it's not a threat everywhere to every sort of established order.
Well, it is. I mean, in China, this has been an issue that the government has had to respond to. People, including not well-off people, but peasants who have access to cell phones, have had kind of relatively spontaneous disturbances. I mean, lots and lots of them, and the government responds to some of them. And that reminds me, this brings us to Evgeny Morozov's critique. He's generally lumped with Gladwell as one of the techno-skeptics, and there was a review of his book in Slate that says the following, and I can't tell if this is the reviewer. Well, they're at a minimum, they're kind of, I think, paraphrasing Morozov. So I think this is his view. Anyway, it says, one of their preferred tactics, meaning the authoritarians, is one of their preferred tactics at the moment is to respond with alacrity to selected complaints. For instance, I mean, let me back up and say, Morozov's larger argument is that authoritarians have ways of counteracting this stuff and sometimes use the tools themselves against the protesters. So he's all about the counter tactics of the authoritarians. Okay, so he says, this is, I think, a paraphrase. One of their preferred tactics at the moment is to respond with alacrity to selected complaints. For instance, the Chinese government sometimes acts to punish corrupt local officials in response to social network grumbles. Well, what's wrong with that? Okay, I mean, the paragraph goes on after a couple of sentences to say, they are leveraging social networks to construct a facsimile of democracy in action, to offer crumbs of political influence to citizens, to counter critics who say that they suppress dissent. It is devious and effective. Well, wait a second. I mean, First of all, this is progress whenever any government responds
Bob,
to the...
You're obviously unfamiliar with the doctrine of repressive tolerance of Herbert Marcuse.
Well,
the idea is that they're co-opting just enough dissent to maintain the status quo. That is...
Yeah, but Mickey, that's what all governments do, right?
Well, right.
Doesn't
if
our
the
government...
lets them do it more effectively, that could be insidious. I'm not saying it's what's going to happen, but
it's
not
internet...
crazy to say it's insidious.
No, but Mickey, you compare it to 20 years ago before the internet. It's not that back then they couldn't respond to these things. It's that the peasants couldn't express their grievances in the first place. So the comparison is 20 years ago, peasants have grievance, can't express it. Now, peasants have grievance, it gets addressed. That's not progress?
It's progress, but Bob, history isn't the seamless march of progress up a slope toward, whatever the end of
No, you have to
history
finish
is.
the metaphor. We don't go anywhere unless you finish that metaphor.
Well, no, it's possible that certain forms of progress could lead to dead ends, and the idea that you could have an authoritarian
Mickey,
state
my point is,
was just
look,
responsive
first of all,
enough
Mickey,
to keep the corrupt elite in power is actually sort of interesting. Isn't that what the mafia does? The mafia provides just enough services to keep the populace in line, but there's still a corrupt, violent mafia.
Mickey, it's what all governments do, including ours. Some interest group makes some demand, and the government says, well, what's the cheapest we can buy them off for? Don't you agree?
Yes, but
that's how just governments in general work, including
democracy
democracies?
is better than non-democracy. So if a non-democracy can do all this, and it maintains its stability by doing it, that's a bad thing, according to us. That's all this...
Well, that's the way all governments maintain their stability, is buying off interest groups for the cheapest they can get them. The point is, this technology has moved the Chinese people in the direction of closer to some perfect state, which we ourselves have not achieved. Maybe we're closer to it than the Chinese, but the point is, more grievances are being addressed.
Right, but they don't have the democracy part, Bob, and this makes it less likely. And if you actually think that democracy is important, that's not necessarily a good thing.
I think democracy is important to the extent that it gets people's actual needs and grievances addressed.
Really? Is that the only reason
I don't think our
for
democracy is doing a very good job of that.
That's the only reason for democracy? A good complaints bureau would take care of it?
Look, I think if you had free speech and a good enough complaints bureau, if you could construct some mechanism for realizing the needs, aspirations, wants of people other than direct democracy, and you had freedom of speech, I would say certainly not grounds for regime change. Doesn't sound that bad.
Wow, there's a spot for you in the Chinese
wouldn't be high
government.
on my list of things to try to change. I mean, look, Mickey, it's the real world. You take what progress you can, and the point is, if the argument is, has this technology made stuff better, I just think it's manifestly the case.
I don't think the argument isn't over whether the technology has made stuff better. The argument is whether the technology is inherently subversive to authoritarian governments. And it's not. It seems to me the argument.
Well, I guess
I don't buy the argument that it helps authoritarian governments because it lets them buy off dissent.
But that's not all it does.
It's not a crazy argument to make.
No, but that's not all it does. It makes them less authoritarian if they stay in power. At least in the case of the Chinese. More and more of. I mean, there was a protest. There was a guy who. Well, I won't get into the details, but. Police brutality and stuff, they have a harder time getting away with. They're not to nirvana yet, but, neither are we.
You have a bourgeois notion of history being the slow incremental progress.
No, I certainly don't believe it's slow incremental progress. I believe there are, massive setbacks and collapses, and I think we could be in for another collapse, and I don't know how the Arab thing is going to play out. And it could certainly, but I just think the technology,
the interesting thing about Shirky's article is that he wimps out. He says he's not for the crude, the crude. I think he calls it the instrumental. I can't read my writing. The instrumental idea that just because you have Twitter, all of a sudden revolutionaries are empowered to overthrow their governments. But he's for they can create he's for the more sophisticated environmental argument where they can create a civil society, blah, 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 of middle-class people that makes it harder for dictators in the long run. What's wrong with the crude instrumental argument? That sure seems to be what's happening.
First of all, we should say, as we said, this is Clay Shirky. I think, he first put some of this stuff out in a book called Here Comes Everybody, I think, and I think he took some flack for it being simplistic, and so he qualifies it more carefully now. I think by crude instrumental, he means the U.S. kind of intervening in specific cases, like to make sure that Twitter is up during the Iranian.
Well, he makes makes you sure the internet infrastructure is in place. He's making a broader argument that I'm not saying that just because they have Twitter they're going to revolt.
Well, he's right. He's right. That's not enough. I mean, you're never going to get revolution until you have people who feel really aggrieved, and that's not a given.
I understand, but he's retreated so much that he downplays the actual impact of Twitter, which seems...
Well, first of all, it's a mistake, as I think he says, to think this is just Twitter or just Facebook. It's all kinds of manifestations of digital technology.
Right, well,
it's the fact that with a cell phone camera, you can upload footage of atrocities that the whole world can see. It's the fact that satellite TV like Al Jazeera crosses borders.
He's backing away from even that. He's sucking up to the State Department by saying, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that in the long run it can build a middle class. No, in the short run... I don't think he's sucking up.
I think he's criticizing American policy of micromanaging. He's kind of... I hadn't thought of this, but he's kind of like Milton Friedman on monetary policy. It's like... No, you don't micromanage the economy. It's like you set your monetary growth at 3% and that's it. He's saying you back certain basic things that you think should always be granted people, access to the internet, blah, 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 and then in the long run, that'll be good. But
he's doing more than that. I mean, obviously, he wants to piss on this idea that if we only back the Falun Gong's protective anti-censorship technology, which apparently is superior to the one that the State Department invented, that somehow we're going to bring down China, that we should do that. But he's also making the broader argument that you shouldn't expect even international, non-nation-by-nation results in the short term. But hey, we have the results in the short term. I mean...
What do you mean? Because the Arab revolt is happening?
He's given away the store in the attempt to look respectable in foreign affairs or foreign policy or wherever he wrote that.
Well, I mean, I think he's... First of all, I think you should make up your mind. I mean, last time you were advancing the neocon line that, hey, it's because we invaded Iraq that we're having these revolutions, right?
No, it's obviously a multi-factor causation, and Tom Friedman wrote a very good column where he goes into the five sort of sub-factors that often get ignored, including Obama's Cairo speech that may have contributed to it. But he too leaves out the Iraq War. That was stunning, which he supported. Obviously, it seems to me the Iraq War has to be on the list. Maybe it was only a 1% cause.
I don't see why it does have to be on the list. I mean, first of all, look, if the Iraq War was...
wrote a very powerful column to that effect this week.
Krauthammer... I would have to... You would take some persuading for me to acknowledge that Krauthammer recently wrote a powerful column. Which one is this?
He pointed out, his most recent one pointed out that, that people, when we overthrew the anti-democratic dictator of Iraq, everybody hated us, and when the Egyptians overthrew it, we're saying, why don't we give them military support? And then he went on to make the argument that obviously Iraq had encouraged these people. The model of the example of a crude, badly functioning but functioning democracy.
Wait, how had Iraq encouraged? I'm sorry, I really missed that. How had the Iraq War encouraged who to do what?
People in the Middle East who are living under authoritarian government say, "Hey, in Iraq they have a democracy. Why can't we have a democracy?"
And he has evidence that was an important force.
Evidence?
Yeah, yeah.
Nobody has evidence for any of this. You don't have evidence that Obama's Cairo speech was an important force either. We're just talking about possible causes.
Well, I didn't say it was.
And Tom Friedman is so
here's the way I would look at it analytically, Mickey. Here's how I would look at it analytically. Okay, I would say if we have two rival theories, there's my theory that, given the direction of information technology, you don't have to invade these countries, These authoritarians are going to come under more and more pressure. You're going to see democracy break out somewhere in the Arab world. You don't have to invade a country. That's my theory. Charles Krauthammer's theory is we got to invade Iraq, or democracy may never come. Okay. Now, if he's right, and there's some contagion effect we're going to get out of invading Iraq and implanting what I guess he's calling a democracy, although we could get to that question later, you would expect with the next breakout of democracy to be like what? Geographically close to Iraq? Culturally close to Iraq? No, in both of those respects, it's as far away as you can get and still be in the Arab world. Tunisia. Okay? Now, what does Tunisia have? It has a relatively high rate of broadband penetration. It has well-educated people who use technology. In other words, Tunisia being the place it happened favors my theory, not Krauthammer's. This is what I mean when I use the word evidence.
Well, but they can both be factors, Bob. Your point is
sure, but what is Tunisia? What is Tunisia having been the location? Which one does it favor more than the other?
Well, Tunisia, but Bahrain would favor Iraq. Bahrain, you have a Shiite.
Yeah, but it didn't start in Bahrain. No, first of all, it wouldn't necessarily favor Iraq. But it didn't start in Bahrain, Mickey.
We're talking about
obviously Tunisia set the whole region on fire.
Causes. And you're so apoplectically opposed to the Iraq war that you won't even admit that it could be a second-order cause.
Look. I mean, the funny thing is, you were in our last dialogue, you said, "Oh, these people are all doing this in emulation of Iraq." I opened the newspaper the next day, and Iraqis are starting to demonstrate against their government in emulation of the Egyptians.
Well, that'll happen too. And American mobsters talk the way they do because they see movies about mobsters and they imitate that. There's always feedback.
Except that they are validly part of it's ethnic, but also they're demonstrating against what is in fact a corrupt and increasingly authoritarian government. There was a piece in the New York Times about how Maliki is pulling all these fast ones where he's concentrating power and making it less and less like a true democracy. Iraq is just not, and not to mention the people get blown up every week there. That is not. You're the only person who considers Iraq some kind of like very powerful role model in the Arab world. The other thing is, because it was a result of external intervention, that also lowers its value.
I agree, it lowers its value. The issue is, is it a factor pushing in the right direction? Not is it the most important factor, but just is it a factor? If you're going to list 10 factors, shouldn't it be one of them?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you ever get any evidence, you have my email address.
But you admitted you have an emotional block against this evidence. It's like
it does not rival your Tina Brown.
It's like my emotional block against admitting that the Vietnam War was right. There's almost no evidence that could convince me of that.
Well, that's an easy one, though.
Why is it an easy? Why is it an easy one?
Because you're right. There's no evidence. Well, there's no evidence that it was right. Just trust me. You're on the right there.
Well, that's okay. That's good. As long as I have your benediction.
And I'm not invested. I was a couple years too young to be out demonstrating.
But that's important to me because we have a strong bond, Bob, not one of these weak Facebook bonds.
No, you and I do have a strong bond, and it's happened largely through digital technology. So Malcolm Gladwell is wrong.
And I think our bond is strengthened by our resentment of Malcolm Gladwell's success. No, sorry, didn't mean to get it.
Speak for yourself, man. Although I did note, we can criticize his argument all we want, but when I was looking at it online, that article was retweeted like 6,000 times or something and was shared on Facebook like 34,000 times. That guy's doing something right that I'm not doing, Mickey. What is it?
He's incredibly successful and popular.
No, that's the evidence that he's doing something right. What is the thing he's doing right to be
He's a really good writer, and even when he's wrong, you want to read his article.
Hey. You're getting a little personal here.
Well, he has hit on the sweet spot of popularizing academic theories for upper middle class people and that's a very powerful place to be. I told you I was in an airport line and a fight broke out between a black guy and a white guy over which Malcolm Gladwell book was better. And they both pulled it out of their knapsacks and were raving with each other. It was like, shit, how did this happen? Anyway, I saw he wanders around the neighborhood here sometimes. He's actually He was very pleasant last time I ran into him.
That's because he doesn't watch Blogging Heads TV.
Well, I have one more question before we move on.
Yeah.
If you're the Castro brothers in Cuba, aren't you terrified that this will come to Cuba?
If I'm an authoritarian anywhere, I'm not feeling as secure as I was.
You would think Cuba, this would be just easy, just like fly over the country and drop. This guy was just tried and I think convicted for giving satellite phone technology that allowed Cuban Jewish groups access to the internet. Mm-hmm. Why do that piecemeal like that? Just fly over the country and drop 1 million cell phones. End of Castro.
End of Castro. Don't they have cell phones over there?
Well, these would be cell phones that could access the internet that Castro couldn't block.
Yeah, that reminds me, there was an op-ed saying that in Libya we should float some kind of balloons that would make sure that people could talk to one another on cell phones, because Qaddafi has cut off the cell phone, all lines to this one city that they're apparently pulling out all the stops to retake. This big port city to the west of Tripoli.
The other issue I wanted to raise is, isn't the logical result of this that if you're a dictator, your response has to be more brutal and more violent than it was before?
Well, this is the argument for having intervened earlier with Qaddafi or intervening now, which is you don't want to set the example as this unrest unfolds in various parts of the world, that dictators can savagely repress the will of their...
Well, but don't you want to wait till they savagely repress and then have an international reprisal that takes them out?
Well, but again, it gets complicated now that it's a civil war. And one thing we have to remember is it's not as if Qaddafi has no popular support. This was a mistake we made in Iraq, to think that autocrats are repressing all of their people. No, autocrats stay in power by delivering benefits to some sizable number of people. So it's not as simple as him repressing all of the people of Libya. He has the people who benefited from his system of patronage, apparently people in 3 tribes in particular. And one problem with waiting is that, because of that, after you wait a while, it assumes the form more of a classic civil war and less the form of a guy seeming to savagely repress, popular will. It becomes a regionalized conflict. So, does that make sense?
Yes, but by the same token, then he doesn't have to really savagely repress.
Well, I think the rebels were close enough to just totally catching him by surprise that actually he has felt that he has had to, like in this pretty nearby city to the west, that's too close to Tripoli for his comfort. And I think he's pulling out all the stops there. I wish I could remember. It's the big port city. Has a Z.
But if you look at the Egypt example, and if Walid Ghonim, is that how you pronounce his name, is as important as you say, the lesson for future dictators is arrest that guy and hang him immediately before he becomes...
Well, the lesson, that sort of lesson is underscored if Qaddafi survives.
Yeah. But it's just it would be an unfortunate sort of
I'm against
dialectical effect of this.
Yeah, but at the same time, I would repeat. Well, I've said that enough. The U.S. cannot control everything everywhere. There's going to be a huge temptation to intervene in Yemen, probably, and I advise against it. But anyway,
do we want to talk about Wisconsin or how prescient I was in our year-ender when I said that the U.S. Postal Service was going to go broke?
I had forgotten your prescience. We can either pick one or the other or do both very concisely.
Well, I'll just do a quick Wisconsin thing. I was preparing to write a incredibly tedious article about which of the anti-union provisions that Wisconsin's Republican governor is trying to push through he could jettison in negotiations with Democrats. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to see how those negotiations work out because he wants to limit collective bargaining of public unions to wages, but they can only get wages of the cost of living. Anything more requires an election. Well, that's obviously sort of bogus, so he can throw that out the window. He wants unions to be recertified every year. Well, that's pretty frequent and expensive, and so he that could get thrown out the window. But the mandatory collection of union dues is what it's really all about. As a friend of mine, and that is the dagger pointed at the heart of unions. That's what they really care about. As a friend of mine said, he almost thinks that unions would rather have the mandatory collection of dues that lets them build political war chests and elect politicians who support them than collective bargaining. Because they're going to get more by electing friendly politicians who then give them what they want than by having the right to bargain and go on strike or whatever without the dues. So of the two, the dues is more important. Both sides know this. The Republican will never give it up. The Democrats will never agree to something that has it, which is why we have an impasse.
Yeah, but I thought I read in your blog that the impasse was about to be...
As I was about to write that, it looked like the Democrats had just caved.
Yeah.
But then after I wrote that, they took it back and said, oh, no, we haven't caved. We're not coming back to allow a vote on these things, which they would lose. And so there's sort of two leaders, and there's obviously a split among the Democrats, which is very bad for the Democrats. Certainly all signs are that eventually they will cave. But, I just got... And one factor is that the Republicans are running recalls against these campaigns against these guys, and they can't go into the state to defend themselves. But, I just got an email from a guy in Wisconsin who was my kind of Democrat who says he thinks Walker has blown it. So I think he meant that blown it in long term, that he'll be a one-term governor and Russ Feingold will come in and beat him. But so the answer is I don't know, but it certainly looks like the majority of evidence is that the Democrats have caved.
But they're not going to cave immediately, as you had thought when you wrote that post.
I thought that it was like a done deal, yeah.
And the scenario was now that some polls show the public supporting them and the unions, they could come back, and even if they lost the vote in the legislature, they would have the public on. They would have won politically.
Yeah, well, I was trying to argue that the pro-union media bias worked against the unions by giving the Democrats the fig leaf that, hey, we're more popular in the popular polls. Both because the MSN would rig the polls, which it is hard to argue, given that one of the polls is a Rasmussen poll, and B, because the coverage has been so pro-union that of course popular opinion is against the governor.
The media.
But I don't even think that. I mean, I think people in Wisconsin turn against the governor because people just want politicians to get the job done, and they don't like disruption. So,
I also think people, the average encounter with a public employee, a government employee, for me is pretty pleasant. They're mostly pretty good, My mailman's a really nice guy.
Well, everybody loves the mailman, but the USPS is going
but
broke.
I just mean,
come full circle.
No, but at the local level, usually you go into town hall, they're nice,
I'm 50-50.
It's like, so what if they're unionized? It doesn't seem to be screwing them up.
I was just talking to a group of Republicans, and I was making my, mushy arguments for a public sphere, and having government institutions that bring the classes together in the healthcare system and the parks, and
and what did they say? They said that's
every
bullshit?
Experience you've outlined is a terrible experience because the government's running it.
They say that by definition it is?
No, they're offering evidence. They're saying the DMV is a horrible experience, the parks are crap, the healthcare system when the government runs it is going to be a disaster. Everything the government runs turns to crap and unpleasantness. And I didn't really have a counter-argument to that. I wish I did. I wish I had brought you along.
Well, I must say I've never chosen to spend an afternoon at the DMV when I didn't have to.
I've had a couple of I had one day when socialism worked, when I took a bus to the DMV and it all was over in an hour and a half and everybody was incredibly friendly. But that's a rare experience.
The fair number of people at DMV are friendly. What do you think of this idea for Obama responding to this Wisconsin thing in the following way? I mean, lots of states are in this kind of trouble, right? Fiscal trouble.
Well, there are two issues: the fiscal trouble and the need for unions to give back, which Walker has won, and the long-term structural change of getting rid of public employee unions,
yeah, well,
which is the key issue that's up in the air. Which, they've already done in Indiana, and they're sort of about to do in Ohio.
I've got a political winner for Obama here. You tell me if I do.
Okay.
So Obama says, all these states are in trouble. It's maybe not surprising that people are taking out on the public employees, but I don't think that's what they deserve. The public employees are. So here's what I'm going to do. We're going to impose a surtax on income beyond like $500,000 at the household level or something. I'm going to distribute it among states on a per capita formula such that, for states with a substantial deficit, this will eat most of that deficit away. For states that have been good and balanced their books, this will be a windfall for them. Meanwhile, there will still be enough left over to reduce the federal deficit a little. And now, this would probably get voted down, of course, in Congress, but I think, wouldn't most people go, yeah?
I don't think so. It's sort of like, Nixon tried that as revenue sharing. There's a rationale for it. It depends how it's framed. It's just framed as Obama bailed out General Motors and now he's bailing out California.
Mm-hmm.
I think he loses that. I think.
No, but he's not just. But that's the difference. Every state gets helped by this. He doesn't just give the money to the states with deficits. He wouldn't be doing this unless
some states were in trouble.
Yeah, but still, if you're in one of the other states, you're not jealous because you're getting exactly the same money per capita that they're getting.
It just seems to me if you tax the rich for health care, that's a bargain people are willing to accept because they're getting something for it. If you tax the rich to share revenue among the governors and
I just think
that's not nearly as tangible a benefit. Let the government, and also you're letting the governors off the hook for imposing discipline on their own houses. What's happening in California with Jerry Brown and New York with Cuomo are things that have to happen. They have to get control of their budgets and get control of their public employee unions. And the idea that Obama would give them money to stave off this day is insane.
Insane is a pretty strong condemnation of my interesting and novel idea, Mickey.
The idea is insane, Bob. You're not insane.
Okay.
You're not a bad person. You just did a bad thing.
Hate the sinner. No, hate the sin, not the sinner.
Isn't that the essential lesson of parenting?
Hate the sin, not the sinner.
You never say you're a bad girl. You say that was a bad thing you did.
That's what they say. But the official parenting dogma is just a series of things that no one has any evidence for, and they cycle on a regular basis. No one has a clue.
Do you have views on model parent Charlie Sheen before we go?
Try not to let them stick paper clips into electrical outlets. Aside from that, it's all a crapshoot.
There's a book in that, Bob.
It's a short one. Okay, so I guess we're out of time.
Do you have Charlie Sheen's thoughts before we go?
Charlie Sheen, why? Are you here to condemn Charlie Sheen?
No, I followed it at a sufficient distance that he seems relatively sane, and what he says seems maybe a little grandiose, but also intelligent. And what's all the fuss about? If you really
what do you think of the what about that anti-Semitic vibe, though?
Sorry?
What about the anti-Semitic vibe?
Is there an no? He pointed out that this guy had changed his name.
Yeah, but he went beyond that.
Even Abe Foxman
the guy's given
condemned
name.
It?
What?
Even Abe Foxman condemned it? Now, what were you about to say?
No, I don't know. Did Abe Foxman condemn it?
I'm joking. I assume so. But was there stuff beyond that? I didn't realize that.
That was kind of weird. The guy, he had, I forget what, it was a kind of a Jewish-sounding last name, and he had changed his name, in his Hollywood manifestation. And so she insisted on referring to him by the last name, but what was odd was that he then used the Hebrew version of his given first name, even though that was not ever his first name. Chaim was never his first name.
Huh.
That was the strange part.
But,
you know what? I read this morning that among the friends of his who have tried to stage an intervention and failed are Mel Gibson. So, there you go. Mel can help.
That's like this friend of mine who was kicked off the Free Republic website for being too conservative.
Well, but I'll tell you, he's had a life probably with more phases of exhilaration than mine.
No, he doesn't have your encounters with me.
there's that.
He doesn't have this.
I say that was his big career blunder.
This thing of ours.
That's why he only has 1.7 trillion Twitter followers, is because he failed to get on the Blogging Heads bandwagon.
It's only like 1.5 million, and he's being paid to Twitter, and who is paying him? I don't understand that. If not the Twitter people.
I don't. Is he being paid?
That's the story. That's what
I heard there were corporations somehow cashing in on his Twitter traffic, but I didn't understand how.
Yeah, I don't either.
It's a mystery to me.
Okay, well.
But see, this is why, Mickey, we should cut these dialogues into two. I could go on another 20 minutes, and we'd have, two enticingly tidy, 40-minute dialogues instead of this sprawling hour and 5-minute dialogue that we're
And the second one would be an
forced
evergreen that was as stale as the most recent cover of Newsweek.
No, we could have had the technology discussion at the end. That would be an evergreen that could run 2 days hence.
You and Tina Brown should have a talk.
If there's any commenters still watching this thing at this point, which I seriously doubt, I encourage them to weigh in. Wouldn't you like, when on those rare occasions when I get Mickey to turn on his damn webcam, to get 2 dialogues out of it instead of 1?
Yeah. Okay.
We'll see. Let the people have their say, which I'm predicting will be
digital communication.
Yeah.
And they'll discover that Blogging Heads is not a democracy, and one day they'll show up at your doorstep with pitchforks, Bob.
Blogging Heads is not a democracy. I've made that point recently to my own staff, actually.
Cool.
But we have strong ties. Okay. See you around.
Thank you. See ya.
My pleasure.
Bye.